The first tendrils of pale rose and lavender light crept over the Atlantic horizon as Matilda, a silver-plumed herring gull with a wingspan wider than most in her flock, stepped to the edge of Gull Rock cliffs. Below, the sea shimmered like liquid glass, vast and unbroken, its surface streaked with the last pulse of phosphorescent plankton fading into daylight. A cool breeze tugged at her primary feathers, carrying the tang of salt and the distant cry of other seabirds stirring on the morning wind. All around her, the gulls of the East Bay colony preened and squabbled in the soft grass, their halting conversations punctuated by raucous squawks. Yet Matilda stood apart, silent and focused, eyes fixed on the boundless blue expanse beyond. She had watched generations of her ancestors huddle on these rocks each spring, waiting for the annual migration south, a route charted by instinct, measured in thousands of miles, then repeated in reverse come autumn. But this year, something within her stirred more urgently than the familiar rhythms of the flock, a yearning not merely to follow the well-trodden path, but to conquer the endless horizon itself. Below the cliffs, the surf pounded in a steady timpani, an orchestra of wave breaks and foam. Matilda spread her wings, flexing the long, primary feathers that gleamed like burnished steel. The muscles along her back rippled beneath her downy coat as she tested the air currents, finding an updraft that would carry her skyward. At exactly 05:17 a.m., she launched herself into that rising column, wings beating in slow, powerful arcs. Her departure drew the attention of the entire colony. A cluster of younger gulls followed her ascent, curious stowaways, while the elders watched in silent awe. Matilda climbed higher, cresting the cliff's lip and banking eastward on the salt-laden breeze. Below her, the coastline unfurled in curving sweeps of sand and rocky points, pale dunes giving way to scrub-covered headlands, territory she had known since hatchling days. As she gained altitude, the world fell away. The colony shrank to a fluttering mass of ivory and gray. The shoreline became a slender ribbon, and finally, the ocean stretched interminable and undivided, its surface alive with the first glints of sunrise. Matilda paused in midair, wings outspread, feathers splayed to catch the slightest current. She circled once, twice, mapping the endless blue that called her name, before cutting westward toward the rising sun, each wing beat sending her farther from the safety of Gull Rock cliffs. In those first moments of her epic voyage, Matilda felt the exhilaration of uncharted freedom. Her keening cry joined the wind's call, echoing across the water like a promise. No longer merely one gull among many, she had become a pioneer of the skies, her heart set on shattering every boundary of migration known to her kind, and charting a course that would redefine the very limits of avian endurance. And so, on wings that spanned more than feathers, Matilda embarked on the journey of a lifetime, the endless horizon, her solitary companion. By the time Matilda left the shelter of the coastal updrafts, the sun had fully risen over Gull Rock cliffs, casting pale gold across the water. In front of her lay the vast expanse of the Bay of Storms, a name coined by generations of local fishermen who had witnessed this stretch's notorious gusts, sudden squalls, and churning seas. Matilda's keen eyes scanned the swell, watching as waves built long, frothing shoulders that broke in thunderous crests. She knew that to shatter the world's record for avian migration, she would have to conquer the Gulf's fiercest weather and emerge stronger on the other side. Entering the first front. Barely 15 minutes after departure, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in like an ominous tide. A cold front approached rapidly, its leading edge heralded by a sudden drop in temperature and a staccato of distant rumbles. Matilda angled her wings into the rising wind, using her powerful primaries to slice through the turbulent air. Each beat of her wings propelled her forward, even as the gusts tried to wrench her off course. She tucked her head low to reduce drag, feathers slick with salt spray, and focused on the single point where sky met sea. Lightning forked in the distance, illuminating the underbelly of the storm in pale purple. Below, waves towered to twice the height she had ever dared to fly above, their peaks whipped into billowing froth. Matilda banked sharply, riding a downdraft along the flank of a towering wave, her clutch of wind-cutting maneuvers honed by months of practice along coastal cliffs. She felt the subtlest shifts in the current, one moment riding a cushion of uplift, the next plunging into a crushing downdraft. Yet her body responded instinctively, adjusting each feather to maintain control. The gale's fury. Within 30 minutes, the Bay of Storms lived up to its name. The storm front crashed upon Matilda like a living wall of wind and water. Rain slanted sideways, sizzling as it struck her back, and gusts roared in her ears like a locomotive. She faced temperatures 10 degrees cooler than at departure and battled thermals so violent they threatened to batter her wings apart. Weak flashes of phosphorescence glowed in the wave troughs below, ghostly bioluminescent algae disturbed by the storm's upheaval. Their pale glow was the only light beneath the roiling sky, a reminder of the deep ocean's own tempestuous life. Matilda's lungs burned as she forced herself upward. Every inhale tasted of brine and chill, and each exhale left a visible mist in the frigid air. Yet she dared not pause. Hovering in place would mean being swept helplessly out to sea. She adjusted her wing stroke to conserve energy, slow, deliberate beats that maximized lift. When the wind rose to gale force, over 60 kilometers per hour, she tucked her body into a slender profile, letting the wind carry her forward with minimal exertion, but each gust still demanded concentration and skill to avoid being spun into a plunging dive. Momentary refuge in a wind shadow. Just as Matilda's strength began to waver, she spotted her first landmark, a rocky islet known locally as Sentinel's Tooth, jutting like a jagged fang from the churning waters. Though the storm battered even this outcrop, its lee side offered a brief wind shadow. Matilda spiraled down to settle there, her claws gripping sodden rock as she panting in exhaustion. 5 rattling breaths later, she lifted her head to scan the skies. Lightning flickered nearer now, and distant rumbles resonated through the stone. With muscles trembling but resolve unbroken, Matilda rose again, this time into a milder crosswind that skirted the islet's lee. She angled her trajectory toward the next landmark, a small chain of fishing boats anchored in the calmer waters beyond. Each boat's mast stood like a beacon of human tenacity, and Matilda used their lights as mid-flight waypoints, hoisting herself higher on pocketing thermals that formed in the lee of each hull. Testing endurance. As the hours passed, Matilda's body began to ache. Feathers around her shoulders rubbed raw. Her legs trembled from constant contraction. Hunger gnawed at her belly. She had left early breakfast behind, and her pectoral muscles screamed for respite. Yet she pressed on, guided by the memory of her ancestors' records and the promise of her own historic flight. Each gulp of storm-whipped air steeled her determination. She would not simply survive this gale, she would master it. Drawing upon every ounce of her innate stamina, Matilda sang aloud a single, keening cree-ock that cut through the gale's roar. Her voice, carried on the wind, was both a declaration of defiance and a signal of life. In that moment, the storm seemed to acknowledge her resolve, its fury abating ever so slightly, offering her the narrowest corridor through which to continue, forging ahead. With renewed vigor, Matilda shot forward, wings ablur in the strobing stormlight. The Gulf's relentless challenge had tested her spirit, but she had emerged not defeated, but honed. As the final squall edged past and distant sunlight began to pierce the clouds, she dared to hope that the worst lay behind her. Ahead, the open ocean beckoned once more, this time calmer, its waves rolling in gentler undulations. With the storm beaten, Matilda straightened her flight path and stared unflinchingly toward the distant coastline of the next landfall. The Bay of Storms had delivered her first great trial. Beyond it lay fresh challenges, but also the possibility of record-shattering glory. and as she sliced through the clearing sky, her silver wings incandescent in the emerging sun, she knew that no gale, no sea, and no horizon could contain the spirit of a single gull determined to rewrite the map of migration. By mid-afternoon, Matilda's wings carried her beyond the worst of the Bay of Storms, and the open ocean stretched calm and cerulean beneath a high sun. Far on the horizon, a smudge of green and gray rose from the water, a cluster of windswept isles known as the Pelican Keys. These low, rocky atolls lay halfway along the great migration route. To many gulls, they were mere landmarks, but to Matilda they offered something more precious: refuge. Touchdown on wind-scarred shores. At 2:17 p.m., Matilda banked low and let out a triumphant "Cree-awk" as she surveyed a crescent of jagged rocks crowned by salt-tolerant grasses. Spiraling downward, she alighted on a wind-swept slab of sun-warmed basalt, claws gripping fissures carved by centuries of surf. Her feathers, once drenched and buffeted, now dried rapidly under the tropical sun. Every inhale tasted of brine and wildflower nectar from the scrubby coastal shrubs. Every exhale was a quiet sigh of relief. As she settled, Matilda flexed her aching pectorals and surveyed her surroundings. Tide pools glittered with starfish and tiny anemones, while herons and pelicans preened on adjacent ledges. The air was filled with the croak of crabs scuttling among barnacles and the distant roar of waves breaking on offshore reefs. Unexpected companions. No sooner had Matilda begun preening the jagged salt from her plumage than a sudden flurry of movement caught her eye. Emerging from a cluster of feathery mangroves was Coral, a bright-plumed tropical kingfisher Matilda had once watched from the cliffs of East Bay. Coral regarded the great gull with a curious tilt of her turquoise head. "Cree-ah," Coral chirped, cocking her brilliant crest. Matilda responded with a soft, respectful "Mark," the universal greeting among seabirds. The two birds, normally solitary in habit, exchanged a brief dance of wings and calls. Coral led Matilda to a sheltered inlet, where freshwater runoff collected in a crystalline pool fed by underground springs, a rarity in the salted world. Sustenance and restoration. At the freshwater pool's edge, Matilda dipped her beak and drank deeply, the cool water soothing a throat parched by endless flying. Coral flitted among low branches, plucking small, sweet berries and offering them in her beak. Matilda tasted them, tiny bursts of flavor, tart and vibrant, fortifying her energy. Nearby, the tide pools yielded up small fish stunned by retreating waters. With expert precision, Matilda speared her first morning meal of herring and blenny, the protein coursing warmth into her chilled muscles. As Coral preened Matilda's wing feathers, removing the smallest tangle, Matilda returned the favor by cleaning salt from Coral's feet with a gentle rub of her beak. Despite their size difference, the two found comfort in mutual care, each recognizing the keen drive to survive this epic journey. Preparing for the next leg. After an hour of rest, Matilda tested her wing beats, each movement slow and deliberate, rebuilding strength. Coral led her to the islet's northeast tip, where an albatross flock rode gentle thermals. One great bird, Alaric the Wanderer, dipped low in greeting and offered news of prevailing winds beyond the Keys. A steady east-northeast breeze, perfect for the next ocean crossing. Matilda absorbed every detail: the wind's direction, the swell's pattern, the albatross's grave counsel. She turned to Coral, offering a soft "Cree-ark," her farewell and thanks. Coral responded with a joyful chitter before darting back into the mangroves, her silhouette a flash of tropical color against the sunlit sea. Taking flight again. At 3:42 p.m., fully restored in body and spirit, Matilda stepped to the rocky edge and launched herself into the rising breeze. Her first beats were strong and sure. Her heart, buoyed by unexpected friendship, pumped adrenaline with renewed vigor. Below her, the Pelican Keys receded, a place of rest and camaraderie that would forever stand as a beacon in her memory. With wings spanning wide against the deepening sky, Matilda set her course toward the vast open ocean beyond, her confidence unshaken, her resolve hardened by island refuge and the kindness of unlikely allies. By the time Matilda soared beyond the Ada Pelican Keys, dusk had fallen, and the sky above the endless sea shimmered with the first stars of night. The air, now cooler, carried the faint salt scent of 1,000 miles of ocean, and the rhythmic slap of her wingtips against the air seemed to echo the distant pulse of the Earth's rotation. With familiar land far below the horizon, Matilda entered the realm where instinct and celestial guidance would become her sole compass. Twilight's celestial curtain. As the sun's last glow faded, the western sky blushed deep indigo, then inky black. Above, the glittering Milky Way stretched in a glowing band, and constellations, Orion's Belt, the Southern Cross, and the Great Square of Pegasus, hung like jeweled signposts. Matilda lifted her head, eyes reflecting the starlight. Centuries of her ancestors had taught her to orient by these patterns, keeping the North Star, Polaris, at a constant bearing and using the curve of the Milky Way to maintain an eastward course toward their breeding grounds thousands of kilometers away. Star-guided flight. At 8:13 p.m., Matilda banked sharply to align her heading with Polaris. Each wing beat was measured and economical, wings locked in the subtle dihedral angle that maximizes stability over long flights. Below her, the dark sea was broken only by phosphorescent swirls of plankton disturbed by her shadow. Above, she drifted within a lantern-lit cathedral of night sky. To conserve energy, she switched between flapping and dynamic soaring, gliding on gentle vertical air movements created by temperature differences between the warmer surface waters and cooler upper currents. In these silent moments, she monitored the star patterns, ensuring her track remained true. When meteor streaks flashed through the heavens, she knew they were brief distractions, not shortcuts, to her destination. Corrections in the current. By 10:02 p.m., a subtle crosswind from the north threatened to push her off course. Matilda corrected her heading by referencing Orion's Belt. When the 3 stars dipped to her right, she angled her flight slightly westward to compensate. Her sharp eyes scanned the darkness below for signs of bioluminescent shoals, often found near undersea cliffs, which might indicate they were nearing the next island chain near the Tropic of Caprica. Encounters in the deep night. Halfway through her nocturnal crossing, Matilda passed a pod of bioluminescent squid rising near the surface in their dance of mating displays. The glowing bursts of teal and violet light rippled across the water, mesmerizing Matilda for a heartbeat. Yet she flapped on, her mind returning to the stellar map above, undaunted by natural wonders, yet inspired by the living lights below. Navigational crisis averted. At 11:45 p.m., the ship's bells of fatigue crept into her chest muscles. A thin mist rose from the sea, blurring the stars and threatening her visual bearings. Matilda descended slightly into a pocket of drier air just above the waves, where the mist lifted in rolling swirls. There she found a temporary refuge of clear sky, enough to spot Cassiopeia's distinctive W formation. Confident once more, she resumed her steady course, the mist parting around her as if acknowledging her determination. Dawn's promise in the night's end. As the hour approached midnight, Matilda felt the first hint of dawn's promise in the eastern sky. A pale, pre-dawn glow beneath the horizon that would soon herald the next day's crossing. In that fragile light, she sensed the nearness of the distant continent. Landfall lay less than a third of her unprecedented journey away. Fueled by star-drawn resolve and guided by ancestral instincts, Matilda pressed onward through the velvet sky, her epic voyage carried aloft on wings over the endless ocean, ever true to the celestial path she had sworn to follow. The pre-dawn sky faintly brightened as Matilda entered the longest leg of her record-shattering journey. Ahead lay the vast expanse of the open Atlantic, nearly 1,200 kilometers to the next landfall, and no island or current to break the monotony of endless horizon. Her wings, now aching from days of continuous flight, flexed with mechanical precision as she settled into a relentless rhythm. Beat, glide, beat, glide. The marathon of the skies. At 03:14 a.m., the stars still ruled the heavens, but fatigue tugged at Matilda's muscles like an invisible anchor. Each wing beat demanded more effort, the air resistant and thin. Below her, phosphorescent plankton glowed in pale swirls, but their beauty offered little solace to a body racing toward its limits. She counted her beats, 100 flaps to each glide, an ancient metronome of survival. Hydration and sustenance were distant memories. Her first and only meal, a breakfast of herring on the Pelican Keys, was now 10 hours past, and her fat reserves had dwindled to bare essentials. She felt the hollow pang of hunger beneath her keel, every nerve screaming for the lunchtime feast she would never take. Yet instinct and sheer will drove her onward, each gust of wind a welcome hand supporting her progress. Confronting the iron crosswinds, by 05:47 a.m., the color of the water below shifted from inky black to slate blue, and the dawn's pink edge glimmered on the eastern horizon. But with the sunrise came the dreaded iron crosswinds, powerful northeasterly gusts that sliced across the Atlantic's surface. Matilda angled her wings into the storm's teal-tinted surge, lowering her head to cut drag. Each second of forward motion was paid for in muscle tremors and labored breathing, but she refused to yield to the wind's intimidation. Thermals were non-existent over the cold waters. The sun's first warmth failed to generate uplift. To conserve her dwindling energy, Matilda alternated between high-altitude glides, where the winds were marginally gentler, and low-pass runs just above the wave crests, stealing momentum from each roller's forward thrust. Mid-flight, she executed a daring wave hitch maneuver, timing her descent into the trough of a breaker and riding the rising lip upward, an ornithological sleight of hand that gained precious extra meters of lift. The mind's marathon. As exhaustion crept in, Matilda's battle became one of the mind. Doubts whispered, "You're alone, no rest ahead, turn back and live." She battled these thoughts by focusing on the glimmer of landfall off at the horizon's curve, and by recalling the cheers of her colony upon departure. Each memory infused her with resolve. She sang her own wing-beat song, a low, rhythmic "Crearch, Crearch," a vocal mantra that drowned out fear. Nearing the edge of possibility. By 07:02 a.m., the horizon's gleam turned into the green-brown smear of distant coastline, the edge of Pelargon Bay's shores. But between Matilda and shore lay a final gauntlet. A 90-kilometer stretch of open sea notorious for hypothermic waves that chilled feathers and sapped energy. Her body shivered beneath its downy underlayer, and her wings stung with each stroke. Muscles quivered, every glide became shorter, every beat felt like lead. Yet Matilda summoned a final surge of will. She lifted her chest and carved a straight line toward the land, sails against the invisible sea winds. Below, waves foamed and snapped at her path, but she pressed on, her cry of effort, a sharp, determined "Crearch" rising above the ocean's roar. Triumph on the horizon. At 08:15 a.m., after nearly 19 hours of unbroken flight, Matilda crossed the indecipherable line where sea met sky and caught sight of the first rocks of Pelargon Bay's headland. Her wings, though trembling, carried her to the safety of an offshore buoy, her final waypoint. Landing with a shuddering sigh, she spread her wings to gather sunlight, each feather glistening like a blade of silver. The long stretches of wind and water had tested her to the brink, and she had emerged triumphant. As she preened the salt-crusted fatigue from her plumage, Matilda realized she had not only survived the great stretch, she had mastered it. In doing so, she shattered all known records for avian migration distance and endurance. And as the sun climbed over Pelargon Bay, its rays igniting the sea into diamonds, Matilda's solitary figure atop the buoy stood as living proof that with courage, instinct, and unwavering resolve, no horizon is truly endless. As the sun climbed high, above Pelargon Bay, Matilda's arrival sent ripples of astonishment through coastal villages lining the shore. Fishermen paused their nets, tourists gasped behind camera phones, and the East Bay Gull Colony, hundreds strong, lifted into the air in a thunderous salute. At 09:02 a.m., Matilda stepped off the buoy onto the rocky breakwater. Her wings, now glossy with salt and sunlight, stretched wide as she issued a triumphant "Creoc!" that echoed over reef and harbor. The news spreads like wildfire. Word of Matilda's unprecedented flight streaked along maritime radios and social media. By midday, a flotilla of small boats, research vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and curious pleasure craft had formed a procession behind her landing point. Local reporters scrambled ashore with microphones and notebooks. Drone cameras buzzed overhead, capturing every proud tilt of her head and deliberate preen of her silver plumage. Mayor Eleanor Jenkins of East Bay paddled out in a bright yellow kayak, waving a ceremonial sash embroidered with the colony's crest. "Matilda, you have shattered the world migration distance record, 1,700 kilometers in under 40 hours, she declared, voice trembling with excitement. The flotilla's horns honked in celebration, and Matilda responded with another ringing cry, a gull's salute worthy of royalty. Reunited with the flock back on Gull Rock Cliffs, the East Bay colony had assembled in a grand V formation overhead. As Matilda soared upward to join them, her arrival was met by synchronized circling flights, dives, and aerial displays, each gull's wings flashing as they welcomed their champion home. Dr. Aisha Patel, recording live for the Global Ornithological Society, watched through binoculars. No one has ever seen such a welcome. Matilda's record will stand for a century, and her flight is now legend. Matilda alighted on her favorite perch, a weathered ledge overlooking the shimmering bay, where her juvenile siblings clambered to greet her. She leaned into their eager nips, ruffling their down with motherly affection. The entire colony gathered on adjacent rocks, their calls reverberating in a rattling chorus that carried across the waves, honoring the champion. That evening, the townspeople of East Bay convened on the harbor promenade. Lanterns were strung between lampposts, and a massive sand sculpture of Matilda, wings outspread in mid-flight, anchored the festival grounds. Fishermen offered platters of fresh fish, and bakers displayed seagull-shaped pastries. At 7 p.m., Mayor Jenkins presented Matilda with the Golden Feather of East Bay, a gilded statuette celebrating courage beyond boundaries. As the gull received the feather at her perch, fireworks ignited the sky, reflecting in her dark eyes like distant galaxies. Legacy in motion. Over the following weeks, Matilda's voyage became the subject of documentaries, scientific papers, and school curricula. Conservationists credited her journey with renewed efforts to protect migratory routes and preserve safe stopover habitats. A fundraising gala, hosted by Dr. Patel, raised significant grants for avian research, and the newly established Matilda Migration Trust pledged to support young researchers in tracking and understanding seabird endurance. In the colony's lore, Matilda's homecoming was chronicled as the Great Gull's Return, a tale of solitary courage and triumphant reunion that inspired both humans and birds alike. And every dawn thereafter, as the sun pierced the horizon, the East Bay gulls took flight in her honor, wings beating in unison, a living tribute to the hero whose voyage redefined what it meant to conquer the endless sky. Long after Matilda's record-shattering homecoming, her singular flight rippled through the world of birds and humans alike, transforming the very concept of avian migration. On the cliffs of East Bay, her empty perch became a shrine, a simple wooden plinth carved with her likeness, wings outstretched, and the dates of her epic journey. But Matilda's true legacy would live on not in stone, but on the wind itself, carried by countless generations of seabirds that learned to dream bigger than the horizons they once knew. Passing the torch to new flyers. Each spring, when the mists still clung to the ocean breeze, East Bay's juvenile gulls practiced their first tentative flights in Matilda's honor. Trainers and researchers, once skeptics, now her fervent disciples, released fledglings with lightweight GPS trackers. As the young gulls tested the same coastal updrafts and thermals Matilda had conquered, ornithologists watched breathless, noting small but measurable improvements in their stamina and route finding. Satellite maps began to reveal subtle shifts. Flocks flew farther between rest stops, hugged coastlines more efficiently, and occasionally ventured beyond known waypoints, echoes of Matilda's solitary audacity. In conservation camps across the globe, hatchlings sat in Matilda boxes, specially designed pens that mimicked the clifftop winds of Gull Rock. The chicks honed their wing beats in safe flight tunnels, their muscles conditioned for longer glides and more powerful flaps. Biologists recorded heart rates and metabolic responses, refining aviary training programs that would one day help other species, terns, albatrosses, even endangered shearwaters, surmount the barriers of climate-stressed migration corridors. Cultural reverberations. On the human side of the story, Matilda's voyage sparked waves of creativity. Poets invoked her name in verses about freedom and perseverance. Painters rendered her silhouette against painted skies. Composers wove her cries and the sea's rhythms into orchestral movements. Schools organized Matilda Migration Days, where children released biodegradable drone kites in her colors, silver, white, and slate, watching them ascend like living tributes. Meanwhile, ecotourism flourished. Hundreds of visitors flocked to East Bay each year to glimpse the gull colony and stand where Matilda first took flight. Interpretive trails led to the cliff's edge, where plaques explained the science of migration, the mechanics of flight, and the heart-stirring story of one gull who defied limits. Local guides, once humble fishermen, became ambassadors of avian wonder, ferrying visitors at dawn to watch the morning exodus, scientific advances, and future frontiers. In laboratories that once studied bird bones and feathers, researchers shifted focus to genetics and biologging. Teams analyzed Matilda's descendants, seeking genetic markers for endurance, lung efficiency, and muscle recovery. Early findings suggested that Matilda's extraordinary stamina left an epigenetic imprint, tiny chemical tags on certain genes, that improved her offspring's capacity for long flights. These insights, published in leading journals, informed broader efforts to bolster wild populations threatened by habitat loss and changing wind patterns. Simultaneously, engineers took inspiration from Matilda's wing beat patterns to design more efficient drone wings and wind-powered gliders, technologies aimed at sustainable oceanic surveying and disaster relief. The Matilda wing became shorthand in aerospace circles for a profile that balanced lift and agility, a biomimetic marvel born of one gull's triumph. A new generation takes flight. Years later, a young seagull named Orion, hatched beneath the very plinth that once bore Matilda's silhouette, prepared for his own migration. As he launched on the dawn breeze, his first strong flap echoed Matilda's in exact cadence. Equipped with a state-of-the-art GPS beacon and a miniature solar-powered sensor array, Orion carried with him the accumulated knowledge of Matilda's legacy, the mapped currents, the island stopovers, the star chart constellations. Thousands of miles away, a research vessel monitored Orion's progress in real time. When he crossed the midpoint of the Clipper Strait, a milestone few gulls had attempted, scientists erupted in cheers, overlaying his track on digital maps that glowed with possibility. For every arc of Orion's flight, for every glimmer of his tiny tracker, Matilda's spirit soared anew. Enduring inspiration, back on Gull Rock cliffs, the original wooden plinth weathered seasons of sun, storm, and salt. But beside it, a new generation of chicks hopped and preened, unfurling their fledgling wings in the shadow of greatness. Matilda herself, long gone now from the physical world, lived on in each gust of wind that lifted a gull aloft, in every star-guided nocturnal crossing, and in the unbreakable bond between wings and horizon. And so the endless sky, once a barrier, became a canvas for dreams. Matilda's voyage, born of singular courage, reached through time to inspire all who dared to glance beyond familiar seas and trust that on wings of hope and determination, no distance is too great, no horizon too far.